Session 18, January 22, 1964. Good evening, chicks. Very good indeed if you are referring to the hypnosis session. Your condition following your first exercise bout should have showed you how badly you were in need of the treatment. When I suggested that you dissociate, I didn't mean that you should break up in pieces. At times, the ego can hold you in a tight vice, which the dissociation breaks. This is what happened after your exercises. You have been doing very well for you in allowing yourself psychic freedom. However, conscious fears cause the ego to tighten its grasp, and some effects of this nature were starting up again. This is why I suggested that you begin these exercises now. The fact that the fearful ego was beginning to tighten explains your reaction to the exercises. The ego can build up around the subconscious vitality like a glacier, and these exercises melt it away. Even the prickles in your neck are like tiny picks taking away icy fears. You are already much improved from just 2 exercises. You were released so quickly last night that quite literally you didn't know what happened. Incidentally, while we are on this subject, often in the past, when you thought you were dealing with a matter or a person in a dissociated manner, you were instead exhibiting a cold conscious detachment. This is an unbending conscious pose of the ego, and not to be confused with the life subconscious detachment, which is actually warm, flexible, and expansive. That is, it can contain within it many elements. Acknowledge them, but be not affected by bad or negative suggestions or elements. As to Jane's feeling about the tree having certain consciousness, or course this is the case. What you have here is much latent energy and vitality and capacity, with much of it withheld or suspended momentarily. The tree is, of course, dissociated in one manner. In some ways, its living forces and consciousness are kept to a minimum. It is in a state of drowsiness on the one hand, and on the other hand, it focuses the usable portion of its energy into being a tree. The state of consciousness involved here is dull as compared to the highly differentiated human ability in many ways. However, in some other manners, the experiences of the tree are extremely deep, dealing with the inner senses, which are, and properly, also properties of freedom. This is something here difficult for me to explain clearly. The inner senses of the tree have strong affinity with the properties of earth itself. They feel their growing. They listen to their growing as you listen to your own heartbeat. They experience this oneness with their own growth, and they also experience pain. The pain, however, while definite, unpleasant, and sometimes agony, is not of an emotional nature in the same way that you might experience pain. In some ways, it is even a deeper thing. The knowledge may not be a perfect one, far from it, but it is as if your breath were to be suddenly cut off. In a manner, this somewhat approximates pain for a tree. The tree makes adjustments as you make adjustments. The tree listens to its growth up from the earth and listens also to the murmur of the growth of its roots beneath. It adjusts each root ending according to what impediments might lie in its way. Without the so-called might of man, it nevertheless retains this inner consciousness of all its parts above and below the ground, and adjusts them constantly. The tree is also innerly aware of its environment to an astonishing degree. It maintains contact awareness and the ability to manipulate itself into completely different worlds, so to speak, one in which it meets little resistance growing upward, and one composed of much heavier elements into which it must grow downward. Man needs artificial methods, for example, to operate effectively on land or in water, but the so-called unconscious tree manages very nicely in two worlds, as diverse certainly as land and water, and makes himself a part of each. I am speaking now of a tree as a he for reasons that I will go into in a further discussion. And as far as motion is concerned, the tree moves upward and downward. It is quite unfair to say that it cannot transport itself since it does so to an amazing degree. The roots and limbs moving in all directions. The inner senses of all plant life are well attuned, alert, and very important. All these fragments have consciousness to a rather high degree, considering that man holds them in such ill repute. If you will remember what you know of the trance state, you are, for example, in a light trance, able to maintain awareness of yourself, your environment, and your place in it. You simply behave somewhat differently, not bestirring yourself in any direction, unless the suggestion to do so be given you. The awareness of plant life lies along these lines. In a deep trance, there is oblivion afterward. That is, the subject, though fully aware of what is going on while in deep trance, can remember nothing of it afterward. The awareness of plant life is also like the awareness of a subject in deep trance, except for the suggestion and stimulus received by regular natural forces on your plane. The plant life does not bestir itself in other directions, but like the subject in trance, all plant is aware. Its other abilities lie unused for the time and latent, but they are present. The awareness is focused along certain lines. The energy is likewise focused. Much of the ability again is suspended as for a subject in a trance. But consciousness is present. Your hybrid planes merely demonstrate this susceptibility to new suggestion which your plant, like your susceptible trance subject, will gladly follow. I will have more to say along this road of thought. But am detoured for just a moment as to which fork to follow. I suggest that you take a break. I always like to get you well worn in first. As you have probably supposed by now, there is consciousness in everything, visible or invisible to you. Each fragment of the universe has a consciousness of its own, pain and pleasure. The strongest aspects of all consciousness are experienced strongly by every fragment according to its degree. Differentiation is of course various, and it is in the degree of differentiation that consciousness is different. In some fragments, such as much plant life and vegetative life, there is strong use of certain inner senses. Your rocks, Joseph, I will call vegetative. Rocks are far from lifeless. Other types of life, including your own, rely on the recognized outer senses. The idea, of course, is a consciousness that is adept at using both the inner and outer senses fully. Your tree lives through its inner senses, experiencing many sensations and reacting to many stimuli of which you are unaware. Minute earth tremors, even the motion of small ants about its lower trunk, are recognized and experienced by tree consciousness. such invisibilities as humidity, radioactivity, and all electrical earthly values are felt as quite real things by your tree and recognized as being separate from the tree itself. A tree knows a human being also, not only, for example, by the weight of a boy upon its branches, but by the vibrations in the air as adults pass, which hit the tree's trunk at varying distances, and even by such things as voices. You must remember my earlier remarks about mental insights, and my remark that color can sometimes be heard and sight be seen. In drawing up his list of so-called natural laws, I have said that man decided that what appeared to be cause and effect to him was therefore a natural law of the universe, not only to these so-called laws, which are not laws, vary according to where you are in the universe. They also vary according to what you are in the universe. Therefore, your tree recognizes a human being, though it does not see the human being in your terms. To a tree, the laws are simply different. And if a tree wrote its laws of the universe, then you would know how different they are. The tree does not even build up an image of man, which is why this is difficult to explain. I have no intention of going deeper into this matter than you can follow at this time. Nevertheless, the tree builds up a composite sensation which represents, say, an individual man, and the same tree will recognize the same man who passes it by each day. Besides the recognized outer senses and the inner senses of which you are just now beginning to gain knowledge, there are other inner and even outer senses which you are not quite ready to understand. They deal with finer distinctions than you know now, being somewhat of the nature of your body's ability to sense another person's aggression. As your body senses temperature changes, so it also senses the psychic charge not only of other human beings, but also, believe it or not, of animals, and to a lesser extent, it senses the psychic charge of plants and vegetative matter. Your tree builds up a composite of sensations of this sort, sensing not the physical dimensions of a material object, whatever it is, but the vital psychic formation within and about it. Size, however, is sensed by a tree, perhaps because of its inherent concern with height. The table around which Ruber now walks senses Ruber even as Ruber senses the table. At a later date, I intend to go quite intensively into the means by which other fragments sense each other and man. The abilities of the tree are latent in man as, dear Joseph, are the abilities latent in the tree. Man's ego causes him to interpret everything else in the light of himself. He loses very much in this manner. The ego is definitely an advancement, but it can be compared to the bark of the tree in many ways. The bark of the tree is flexible, literally vibrant, and grows with the growth beneath. It is a tree's contact with the outer world, the tree's interpreter, and to some degree, the tree's companion. So should man's ego be. When man's ego turns instead into a shell, when instead of interpreting outside conditions, it reacts too violently against them, then it hardens, becomes an imprisoning form that begins to snuff out important data, and to keep enlarging information from the inner self. The purpose of the ego is protective. It is also a device to enable the inner self to inhabit the physical plane. It is, in other words, a camouflage. It is the physical materialization of the inner self, but it is not meant to snuff out the inner self. If, for example, our tree bark grew fearful of the stormy weather and began to harden itself against the elements, in a well-meaning but distorted protective spirit, then the tree would die. The sunlight and so forth could never penetrate. The sap could not move upward, for the trunk would solidify through and through, trying all the while to protect, and killing the tree with its obsessive kindness. This is what the ego does when it reacts too violently to purely physical data on your plane. As a result, it stiffens, and you have, my well-meaning friend, the cold detachment with which you have faced the world. I do not want to disgrace here. I have certain points in mind for this event. Nevertheless, lest Ruber thinks he is getting off scot-free. Let me remind him that the tree's bark is quite necessary, cannot be dispensed with, but I will get into that and into Ruber at a later time. Take a break, and then I will have more to say about the bark which barks too loudly. The idea of dissociation could be likened to the slight distance between the bark and the inside of the tree. Here we do not have a rigid bark, as you should not have a rigid ego. We have instead a flexible bark, changing with the elements, protecting the inner tree or the inner self, but flexible, opening up or closing in rhythmic motion. The bark is, so to speak, outside our tree, and there is a small space between the inner tree and the bark. This small space is our dissociation. The inner tree continues to grow because the bark is flexible. Man lets his ego face the outer world, as does the tree bark, and this is its purpose. Nevertheless, the inner self, like the inner tree, must have room to expand. The tree bark makes allowances for good weather, though bad weather is repulsive to the bark. Nevertheless, the bark makes whatever adjustments are necessary and is flexible. Forgive me if this is a trite analogy. I almost hate to say it, but it bends with the wine. It does not bend when there is no wine, nor does it solidify, stopping the flow of sap to the treetop for fear the down tree, not knowing what it was up to, would bump its head against the sky. Neither should the ego react so violently that it remembers and reacts to past storms. In the midst of clear and sunny weather, you can understand this analogy, Joseph. You know that such a tree bark would be dead to the tree. What you must still understand is that the same applies to yourself. What Ruber must learn is that it is equally ridiculous to act as if it is a summer day when snows are falling. The tree has enough sense not to show blossoms in the middle of a blizzard. However, the danger is stronger on your side. When you are overly concerned with physical matters, and even vital physical matters, you pull yourself in. And more ridiculous, you pull up your roots. A tree would never pull up its roots. I am not speaking now of pulling up your roots in terms of moving from one location to another. I am speaking of something akin to cutting off your roots from any nourishment whatsoever. We come again to the problem of practicality, and at the risk of repeating myself, let me say that in the past, Ruber's seeming impracticality has been more practical than your intellectual practicality. This is merely because you have not trusted your ego's ability to offer adequate protection. You have forced it into anxiety so that it overcompensates trying to protect you and ends up half choking you to death. Do you want to sit in the rocker? Ralph said, no, I am okay. She said, for instance, this experience in psychic phenomena would seem to be simply unenjoyable, enlightening, but purely impractical happening. If you were as ego-bound as you were last year, you would not have had either the time, nor energy, nor even the inclination for it. It would not have seemed practical. Nonetheless, it may prove extremely practical in terms of that beloved financial God. If so, and I believe you will find this the case, it is because you did not block it. You may very well find in the future that a good deal of your income is derived in this fashion, but it will not be the main benefit by any means. Your work is improving and will improve constantly. It may seem, or it did seem, unreasonable to you that personality had much to do with so-called advancement in the artistic world. And yet, people sense your attitude toward them very strongly. Excellent art will triumph always, because it speaks clearly. But in the lifetime of many artists, it must compete with personal vibrations, if you will forgive the word, of the artist himself. You have already opened up. This does not mean that you became dishonest in your relationships with people, merely that you became large enough to contain the knowledge of good and evil in people, and to observe it as part of what is. If you have no objection, I will continue, or you may take a break if you suggest. Ralph said, no, let's continue. She said, when you start out by trying to be practical in cold terms, you rarely succeed, because you close yourself away from what does not seem to be practical in your terms. But your terms are not the only terms that apply. The inner self, and I will make these differentiations for you clearly either now or later. The inner self is nourished by many springs. To cut off one is a danger. To cut off many is disastrous, and prevents any sort of practicality, since half of your abilities will not be used. The confident inner self will let the ego manipulate in the physical world, but will not allow it to become fiercely overprotective. Your work contains the strength of your inner self in many ways. Your particular ego's function is to show this work to the world as you know it. I hesitate, and I mean this, to offer practical advice to one who tries to be so practical. But, my dear Joseph, there is no true practicality in smarring your abilities by working in a position where you cannot use your abilities. You will not be paid for abilities you cannot use, since I know you must think in financial terms. Your ego's job is to help you trade your true abilities for your daily bread. A job which prevents you from using these abilities is at best a compromise and at worst a sore stunting experience. At the present time, you both are maintaining your physical status very well. If you are worried about social status, I am afraid I'm not much help. But I will say this. This will get better, because you allowed yourself to expand. Fear always contracts. Ralph said, we'll take a break now, Seth. She said, you may take a break. If you do not mind, after the break, I will continue for a short while. I am trying very hard, Joseph, because dissociation will answer more than one of your particular problems, and the practical ones at that. Associations which you may consider impractical are often very practical. I always feel when I speak along these lines as if I must say over and over that I do not intend any shortening of your working hours, only that you have more energy than you realize and that associations, as certainly you must see with your landlord, are often practical. Take your break. I hate to bring this up, however, you are the one who brought it up. Had you stayed in Miami, your crazy Ruber would have pointed out an apartment house in a fair section of the city, but rather far from the ocean. I believe something like Dunlap Street, where you would have found an apartment. She would have talked the landlord into taking 1 week's rent instead of 2 months' rent in advance. There is a supermarket 3 blocks away where she would have gotten a job that would have lasted 7 months. At the end of this time, you would have had a job in an advertising firm. You would have gotten by very well. You would not have stayed at the advertising firm over 18 months. However, Jane would have worked in an art gallery. This experience was ahead of her, not foreordained, but ahead of her in any case. You would have ended up in the same gallery. The opportunity was waiting. I do not tell you this to make you feel badly, only to show you once again that you should tread your impulses, because in your particular case, your ego has overbuilt its defenses. Your impulse at the time was the same as Jane's, if you remember, but you were afraid of the practical aspects. Your parents would have visited you last year and be strongly tempted to settle in a small town northeast of Miami, where your father would be amazed at the opportunities in his own business. Things have changed. Free will constantly operates. I will not attempt to give you definite so-called practical advice now, but you can learn from this and the path will be clear. Ruber's strong feeling was correct, his compulsive feeling that you should leave Sarah. At the time, a trip to Florida would have been fine, although a meeting with Ruber's father on prolonged terms was not a good idea. Had you left Ruber's father for Miami, you would have done well. Had you, Joseph, offered an alternative to going with Ruber's father, Ruber would have accepted it, and you would have done well. Ruber sensed the growing explosion with your parents, sensed the frigid growth of your ego, and impulsively had to do something. Had you not left at all, circumstances would have been far worse in any case, and your parents might have suffered another, but this time fatal, accidental. Ruber, of course, did not know this in practical terms, but he knew it nevertheless. Had you stayed any longer with Ruber's father, the circumstances would have been tragic. A meeting would have occurred between Ruber's Mr. Burrell and Ruber's father in a bar in Marathon, in which Mr. Burrell would have fatally wounded Ruber's father. It was this that Ruber sensed and that caused the emotional explosion. Mr. Burrell would have come to the trailer to tell, and I will say Jane now, that she did not have to pay the 17 and 5 cents short on her register. Jane's father would have asked Miss Burrell to go to the bar for drinks. The fight would have been started by Jane's father, Major, I believe that is her name, would have flirted with Mr. Burrell. You would have been painting in the trailer. Jane would have gone with her father, since I think this particular bar was only a short distance away. It was for this reason that Jane was antagonistic to Mr. Burrow from the beginning and filled with panic. What sent her off was not the disappointment over the teaching job, which fell through, but the sequence of events such as Mr. Burrow's advances and her subconscious knowledge of her father's nature. Since she was unable to explain this in logical terms, not understanding it herself, this triggered the acute, psychologically called thyroid condition into new activity. She set up the worst first of which she was capable to get out, and thankfully for you both, she succeeded. Had you stayed in my era, you would have been ahead of the game, but you are still ahead of the game by getting out. Whenever Ruber or Jane puts up such a fight against you, there is good reason, because Ruber is trying to learn gentleness this time and because he is a woman strongly attached to you. His respect for you is boundless, and in most cases he will give in to what he considers your superior judgment. When despite this the present Jane puts on a strong emotional guise, it is because the intuitions put her to this extreme. You would have had difficulty also had you stayed in Sarah on returning from Florida. You cannot allow these things to inhibit your spirit, but your mother cannot understand a man who does not have what she considers the ordinary social responsibilities. The situation would have been much worse. Ruber was overly wary, and if I may say so, brave. He would have tried to make a serious mistake at this time. In pity and against his own intuition, he would have tried to move with your parents. You would have both attempted to support them, with disastrous psychic effects. There is little more I would like to say here. I promise you that neither of you will feel any poor results from tonight's long session. Please do take a break. You're far ahead for leaving Sarah to begin with, regardless of anything else. The most long-lasting tragedy would have occurred had you stayed there. The same sort of a possibility will not exist again. You avoided it together. Jandy pushed for the Amara move, feeling instinctively that Sarah was a mistake. If you remember, at one time, when you had just arrived from Florida, she convinced her landlady to give you an apartment with no money down. This was another opportunity out that would have avoided the nearby association with your parents, but was not taken. By this time, Ruber Jane was so confused that he would have taken the radio position in Amara, and here again, this would have been an error. In fact, Joseph, and I have not said this to make you feel better, but because it is the truth. You literally saved her life. She would have taken a private plane to Minneapolis. The plane would have crashed, and she would not have survived. So if you think of opportunities missed, think also of tragedies avoided. Because but for you, she would have taken the job to get out of Sarah. I wanted to bring all these points up this evening, so that you will see that while you did not always take the best course, you had the sense between you to avoid the worst ones. I would suggest that you keep up a closer correspondence with your younger brother on a personal basis, and I suggest this rather strongly. I would also suggest that you visit your younger brother much more frequently than you have in the past, and indeed that you do not let more than 2 months go by before you visit him for a weekend. Unlike you and Lauren, he does not have a strongly developed ego core to protect him. He is somewhat like a snail without a shell, and could benefit strongly by your affection, shown in a more practical manner. He is indeed much like you, but without your artistic talent and without your overly developed protective mechanism. His liking for the planning of houses will grow, and will compensate him for your artistic talents, which he has always envied. Even Lawrence's daily darling with trains is a compensate for the envied, almost magical to him, abilities of an older brother. If you can understand this, you will see his natural desire to supersede you in the affections of your mother. He never could compete with you in this respect, and it has made its mark. If he seems womanish at times, fussy and vindictive, it is for this and other reasons, not your fault in any way, yet nevertheless a fact. Dick, being so much younger, saw no reason why he should be able to compete. He identified with you and loved you. His wife is a great help to him, but so far he has not fully developed his intellectual capacities, for many reasons, and he has a tendency to blame her for it. Outside of your mother, who left her mark very strongly on you, you have been the dominant active psychic member of your family, exerting very strong influence on all. Your father somewhat resented your seemingly magical projections of reality into paintings, since he worked futilely in the realm of material inventions and got nowhere. He also, to a much greater degree than you, never trusted his instincts, although they were very strong. Your mother had much to do with this, and so did his own mother. Inheritance is extremely potent in this case. Your father represents a most tragic example of impulse frozen into inactivity, and the practicality which was never practical but molded him into immobility. His powers so encased by fear that he could not manipulate in a physical environment at all. I presume that you are weary. However, if you can bear with me after a break, I can discuss your parents in a way that may be beneficial. And please inform my smoke-stock friend that this smoking will come to a short and hasty end. When I said that you saved Rupert's life, I meant it quite literally. In a sense, Rupert saved your parents' lives by insisting that you leave Sarah when you did. Any more mistakes you both may have made are more than made up for because of this. Jane's father is still in danger of losing his life violently, but if he survives the next 5 years, he will die a natural death, before 70, I believe. I do wish to show you how things happen or almost happen. They are always clear reasons, though not necessarily clear causes. Lauren is as lucky in his way with his wife as you are in yours. I will go into Rupert's background later. It does not have as immediate implications, however, since she or he has erected his own barriers along these lines, and the parents are not so involved as far as distance is concerned. Rupert or Jane amputated the present mother for necessity's sake and for survival's sake. Her water then comes in here very definitely. However, it is too late now to go into details. The circumstances were so unusual that more leeway is permitted. That is, Jane, got away with more without guilt because she was so frightened. I began this session with a desire to discuss vegetative and plant life. To me, you see, there is no on life as you usually consider rocks and pebbles. However, I felt this a good time to go into personal background as the session continued. I promised to get back to more philosophical matters, but I did want you to know the dangers and the tragedies you have managed to avert, since I also told you of the opportunities that you had missed. You will see that you came up on top of the pile after all. And now, my dear friends, I bid you a fond good night. I can only say that I hope I haven't caused you pain, since the opposite is my intention. I am with you whenever you are able to permit it. Incidentally, your purring cat is very pleased with his home. You have large hearts, certainly large enough to let at least part of the world in. I would apologize for the lengthy session, but I know you will benefit very much. Good night. Goodbye, yes, goodbye.